There's one for you, 19 for me.
Why were so many musicians forced into tax exile? Picture this. You're on tour promoting your latest album, which is selling millions. After a grueling schedule, months away from home and family, you finally come home completely exhausted to learn that you owe millions in taxes, which is more than you have after everything is paid. The heavy-handed tax policies leaving you with nothing to show for your hard work. George Harrison wasn't kidding when he sang "One for you, 19 for me." Would you pay a 90% tax rate, or would you take your hard-earned money and find somewhere else to live with a more favourable tax code? That is the dilemma that many high-profile musicians found themselves in amid the 60s and 70s while rock music was exploding. During that time, the tax rate in the UK was a whopping 90 to 98% for high earners with super tax and surcharges. Pure insanity. Luckily, someone eventually stepped in and made a change that helped alleviate the insanity for a while. Back to that shortly. While many stayed and were able to come up with the money, others found themselves unable to pay their extremely large tax bill after they paid all of their other expenses. Creating a record and going on tour is costly. Additionally, does it de-incentivize the musician from making more music if they know they are going to have nothing to show for it when everything is said and done? And if you're distracted with figuring out how you're going to pay your tax bill, then you're not exactly focused on creating music. A flourishing society is rich in music and the arts. So ask yourself if you agree with their decision, and if you think this hindered their creativity in any way. Hear their point of view, and leave a comment with your thoughts. This is too difficult for a mathematician. It takes a philosopher. The hardest thing in the world to understand is the income tax. Albert Einstein. So, here are some of the musicians who made the tough decision to leave their homeland behind and relocate to other more business-friendly locations, and others who stayed but found creative ways to lower their tax burden without leaving their beloved England. I want this tour to be fun, to be a laugh, otherwise why bother? They tell me I'll make $1 million out of this gig, but you know, $1 million. I'll see $10,000 by the end of it. It's always like that. You're lucky if you walk away with a new white suit. Mick Jagger, 1975. The most controversial band to leave the UK on tax exile was the Rolling Stones in 1972. They even had some fun with the ordeal by titling their album Exile on Main Street. Though they sold millions of records in the 60s, poor management decisions left the Rolling Stones with next to nothing. Mick Jagger told Fortune magazine how they found themselves broke. In the early days, you got paid absolutely nothing. I'll never forget the deals I did in the 60s, which were just terrible. You say, "Oh, I'm a creative person, I won't worry about this." But that just doesn't work, because everyone would just steal every penny you've got. Each of the Stones owed the British government £250,000 in taxes, equivalent to £5.6 million today, or $28 million owed by the band as a whole. They decided to move the band to France to avoid taxes and shelter their earnings in a Netherlands holding company. Mick explains their position. "We had to leave England to acquire enough money to pay the taxes, because in those days, in England, the high tax rate was 90%, so that's very hard," Jagger said in an interview. "You made £100, they took 90. So it was very difficult to pay any debts back. So when we left the country, we would get more than £10 out of 100. You know, we might get 50 or something." He reacts to being called greedy. "No one likes to pay more for things than they are worth. My early childhood memories are of rationing, so I am frugal, and I do look down on people who waste things." Keith Richards explained the situation to The New Yorker without apology. "The whole business thing is predicated a lot on the tax laws. We left, and they lost out. No taxes at all." In his 2010 book, Life, Keith further describes the situation. "Mick would come and visit me in Switzerland and talk about economic restructuring. We're sitting around half the time talking about tax lawyers, the intricacies of Dutch tax law vis-a-vis the English tax law, and the French tax law. All of these tax thieves were snapping at our heels." More than 45 years later, Jagger and Richards remain tax exiles, only allowed to spend a few months a year in the UK. Jagger commutes between homes in London, France, and the West Indies. Richards lives in Connecticut. Bill Wyman explains his point of view.
When we all went to France because we couldn't afford to live in England anymore. We'd been a #1 band for 8 years, and suddenly we had no money. We didn't own anything that was supposed to belong to us, and we owed the taxman a lot of money, which we thought was paid, so we had to leave. And then we were accused of being like tax exiles, reaping the benefits. It's the only thing we could do. Otherwise, pack up, and become a taxi driver or something. That was a bit of a downer because I didn't really want to live in France, but I had no alternative.
It's not just the UK they are careful about. They keep tabs on all high-taxing locations they are touring as well. Promoter Michael Cole told The Independent, "The Stones are also extremely careful with respect to the number of days they spend in the States. They always really count those days. That's why they rehearse in Canada. That's why they play there at the beginning and the end of their North American tours. Also, there's sponsorship involved, and the Stones make a significant amount. I'd guess $1 million on merchandising per date. The band resents being called tax exiles as they work very hard and pay their employees well. As Bill Wyman explained, they came up short when it was time to pay the taxman, saying, tax under the Labour government of Wilson was 93% if you earned £1 million, which we didn't. You'd end up with 70 grand. So it was impossible to earn enough money to pay back the inland revenue and stay here, in England. The money's got them in trouble. They can't even live in their own country. They have to go from one hotel to another, from one big house to another." Ian Stewart, 1975. While the Stones left England, their contemporaries the Beatles paid the taxes, at least in the beginning. George wrote Taxman to expose the situation, and in the midst of their lawsuit to dissolve the band, the Beatles lost even more to attorneys and the court. Harrison said later, "Taxman was when I first realised that even though we had started earning money, we were actually giving most of it away in taxes."
Me what I wanted for.
Here is what George Harrison has to say about the taxes the Beatles paid.
Would you have enough money now to retire for the rest of your life?
Well, we paid most of it to the government, actually. We paid 93% of everything that was ever earned. So we don't have a great deal of money.
While George and Paul stayed in England and paid the high taxes, Ringo fled to Monte Carlo in 1975, where he said he paid no income taxes, and John lived in New York until his death. Ringo moved back to England and then to Los Angeles through the years, and eventually settled in Monaco, another tax haven.
Having a good time back in good old England. We got to fly soon. You know how it goes with Dennis. Dear Dennis, private enterprise, no artists in the country anymore. He must be dazed and confused.
I'm paying 98% tax, which isn't too bad, is it? One day you're playing the blues, and the next there's a knock on the door, and you're in the realm of high finance. I've got nothing for investments, no stocks, no bonds. The only land I have is what's around my house. Jimmy Page, 1975. The Who's Roger Daltrey stayed in England and declared, "You only have tax problems when you make a profit." Who says the Who are making a profit? What do you think it costs to run our sort of business? David Bowie soon followed the Stones out of England and into tax exile. Bowie moved with his then-wife Angela to Switzerland in 1976 after a stop in the United States. Angela wrote in her memoir Backstage Passes that Bowie had to leave to avoid paying increasingly hefty taxes. If David were to remain a resident of California, he would have to pay a hefty tax bill. $300,000 was the figure I was told, with money he didn't have. As I understood it, these were tax debts accumulated over the previous few years, during which time vast quantities of taxable cash he had generated had vanished into various murky areas. Angela negotiated their move to Switzerland, a tax haven where she was educated. I got what we wanted and better. Legal residency in Blonay, a charming village above Lake Geneva, near Montreux in the French-speaking part of the country, and an almost ludicrously low tax rate of about 10%. Mark Bolan also moved to Los Angeles in 1973 to avoid England's high tax rate. Rod Stewart moved to Los Angeles. He first warned of this possibility in 1974 to Melody Maker. "The government thinks it'll tax us bastards right up to the hilt because we won't leave, but that's wrong because I will if I want to. With a 90% tax ceiling, it's just not worth living in England anymore."
So between what did I say?
Cleaning
digging
shovels.
graves and Highgate Cemetery. I was a beatnik, and then I was a fence putter-upper. You're an ignorant job. Well, never mind. It was a taste of life.
Garden fences.
No, not garden fences. You know, big fences.
Yeah.
And so I was.
Oh, Rod, was your first record Wake Up Megan?
No, I did a few more. That was the first successful one.
Wake up, Maggie, I think I got something to say to you.
He goes on in his autobiography to explain how he made good on his threat to become a tax exile. This didn't go down particularly well with the British press, who thought I was betraying the land of my birth. It didn't go down especially well with Elton John either. Round at his place one evening, I told him I was thinking of quitting Britain, and he called me a traitor and put on Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance marches at a volume so high that we couldn't talk over it. Stewart explained to Rolling Stone why avoiding high taxes was so important. You know, they don't seem to understand you only get one bite of the apple. I can't be doing this for the rest of me life. I don't want to do it for the rest of me life. You do an apprenticeship for 7 or 8 years like I've done. Well, like everyone's done. And then you earn a lot of money in 1 year and they want to take 90% away. I mean, I'd stay. Just leave me a little bit. Just enough to get by on. But 98%, Christ. Stewart's decision to leave Britain was reflected in the title of his 1975 album, Atlantic Crossing. Phil Collins left England for Switzerland. Like Stewart, he warned of this possibility in an interview. If they put up taxes, I'd consider going abroad, and soon made good on his promise. Although Collins later said that he moved with his Swiss wife. So nowadays, these musicians have found a way to hold on to much of their earnings, but it was a reaction to the tax code which forced them into a corner. If the policies would have been more reasonable in the beginning, then maybe they would not have gone to such extremes to avoid paying. And when you consider that many young rock musicians of that era hadn't worked or had much of an education prior to forming a band, they weren't thinking to save their money for taxes. Additionally, many dealt with shady managers who took their share and left their clients to figure out their own financial affairs. While it may sound simple to up and move, imagine someone with parents or siblings they are close to. Also, if they had children like many people did in their 20s at that time, they had to upend their lives as well or leave them behind. And while it's nice to visit other countries with different languages, food and customs, to live there permanently is something else entirely. What these high taxes fail to realise is that people with options don't have to just stick around and take it on the chin. They can move. So if you calculate how much England lost, not just in tax revenue on record sales, but also in the business and jobs that these musicians would have brought by doing business in and living in the country, they lost quite a bit in the long run. So how did it finally change? Here is a brief overview of the UK changes in tax policy throughout this period. In 1971, a Conservative government cut the top rate of tax on earned income to 75%, but a 15% surcharge on unearned investment income kept the top rate at 90%. In 1974, a Labour government hiked the top rate on earned income to 83% for a top rate of 98%, the highest permanent rate since the war. In 1980, Margaret Thatcher's Conservatives cut the top rate of income tax to 60% and reduced it to 40% in 1988. The investment surcharge was abolished in 1985, and the era of the tax exile ended. So there you have it. What would you have done, and do you agree with the musicians who left? Do you think high taxes affect creativity in the long run? Thank you for watching, and be sure to like and comment. Your support is greatly appreciated.
I mean, there's a guy appointed by the court called a receiver, and all the money goes to him until we settle it. He won't even give us the money to pay the tax, even though he's appointed by the court, who is run by the government, who also runs the tax. But in that, the last I heard in there was $40 million.
In the company itself?
No, that's in the Beatles receivership, $40 million. But out of that, you see, the longer it goes on, we probably will owe $20 million of the dollars to the lawyers and the accountants and the Queen's Counsel, and we even have to pay the receiver.
Yeah.
It's silly. And then we have to, if we ever got it solved out there, then we'd end up, say, with 20 or 30 million out of that left. Then we have to pay the tax, which is sort of like super tax, which is, it's ordinary tax plus surtax, they call SUR, and then super tax. So we end up, like owing them money. I mean, we'd be lucky out of that. I mean, so really, the point of it is, there's a lot of money about, but it all is owned by somebody else in a way,